Hello and welcome back to the online sociology lesson series. In this section I'm going to be looking at the technique for the 30-mark question and do an example based on question 4 for paper 1. As I said previously, all 3 of your sociology exam papers are worth 80 marks and you are allocated 2 hours for each paper. This means we can use the general timing rule for every question on every paper to spend 1.5 minutes per mark. Therefore, for question 4 on paper 1, that's worth 30 marks. As a rough guide, you should be spending 45 minutes on this. The good news is that the same command words will be used across different papers and topics. This means that the same skills and structure can be used. Obviously, it will have to include information relevant to the different topics, but this question type will appear as question 4 in paper 1 on education, and again as question 4 for crime and deviance in paper 3. The only difference between this 30-mark question and the 20-mark evaluate question that appears twice on paper 2 is that you spend longer, hence more detail, for 30-mark questions. As we did for 4, 6 and 10-mark questions, we can apply some general rules to this 30-mark question. Firstly, the timing rule of 1.5 minutes per mark means that for this 30-mark question you are advised to spend 45 minutes planning and writing. That's a fair chunk of time, meaning your examiner is going to be expecting a fairly hefty response here. As always, read the question and item very carefully, pay close attention to the wording of the question and look out for specific words and phrases. Be careful to spot, for example, if the question asks you about social groups, that means you must talk about at least more than one. The item for this question will give you an outline of what to include in the question and gives you an overall guide, but don't limit yourself to just what is stated in the item. You're expected to cover more points, issues, perspectives and go beyond what they say. You can quote and develop the item, but it's not a requirement in the same way as it was for the 10-mark question for question 3. If you do use the item, you must put it in quotation marks and explain, expand, or use it as a launch pad for further discussion. I'll look at the specific parts of the essay later on, but for the moment just be aware that your response to this question is in the form of a standard essay. That means that you begin with an introduction, have a main body, and then finish with a conclusion. At the most basic level, since the command word is always going to be evaluate, this question requires you to discuss the view in the essay title and then look at least one different perspective, reason, cause, view, etc. The next point is the same as I said in the video for 10-mark questions. It may sound obvious, but some students still don't do this, so make sure you're not one of them and make sure that you are using what is broadly described as sociological evidence, as noted in the last part above. Concepts, examples, evidence, findings from named studies, theories and theorists where necessary. As we did for the 10-mark question in the previous video, we can look at the features of the top mark band, but this time for a 30-mark question. This is broadly the same as the 20-mark questions on paper 2. These are the 3 assessment objectives in sociology, more commonly referred to as AOs, and all 3 of these are assessed in 30-mark questions, as they are for 10 and 20-mark questions as well. For the 30-mark question, there are 12 marks for AO1, 9 for AO2 and 9 for AO3. In order to make sure that you're hitting these AOs, we'll have a look at the essay and paragraph structure in a bit more detail. Hello, I'd like to introduce myself. As the saying goes, first impressions count, and you want yours to be a good one. We could use Goffman's term impression management here, but don't stress too much about this. You don't need to do anything fancy or indeed too detailed here. You may want to consider the structure above, but the main thing is that you want to get on with writing your essay. So this is a general introduction starter idea. I'll do an example with an essay question later to provide a bit of context. Disclaimer, other paragraph structures do exist. However, I think this one is quite useful because it helps us to hit the assessment objectives we discussed earlier and it allows you to enter the top mark band. Therefore, I'm going to use PERC, P-E-R-C. As I said, at its most basic level, your essay needs to be agreeing, supporting, providing further evidence, criticising, looking at alternative explanations. Therefore, in the main body of your essay, start each paragraph with a clear point, the P, in PERC. The point is in relation to the essay title. As I said, this could be as simple as saying something such as a theory that would agree with the statement in the essay title is. The E stands for explain. You need to explain how the point that you've just made relates to the essay title. Therefore, you need to explain with R. R stands for reference. You need to explain how your points relate to the essay title with reference to, and again this relates to the assessment objectives in the top mark band, that is reference to sociological evidence. Again, we'll have a look at this with the example essay, but this is really important and it's why you need to be revising concepts and what the findings of the sociological research you've looked at tells us. Try to apply this to the question rather than simply describing the findings. The PERC paragraph finishes with C, which refers to criticisms. If you go back to the mark scheme, then the C in PERC is really handy because it reminds you to criticise in the same paragraph the point that you've just made. This is what was meant by the phrase, evaluation will be explicit. Evaluation will be positive as well as negative, but that doesn't lead to such a snappy mnemonic. This structure then is really just as a reminder of what you need to include, and also it helps you when you start to think about what it is that you need to be revising. You need to know examples, you need to know arguments, you need to know debates, findings from studies, key concepts, evaluation. Practice learning these and practice writing what was considered to be PERC paragraphs for exam questions. This framework is one way of getting into the top mark band. If your introduction is your first impression, then your conclusion is your last. Your examiner will read this before deciding on your mark. Your conclusion ideally starts with these two key words to signal that is how you're signing off. In conclusion. Again, if you want to keep it simple, wrap up the debate, link back to the question. If it's possible on the balance of what you've said to reach some sort of conclusion, then now is the time to say it. You might recognise this character from your childhood. It's Flat Stanley. Let's make a plan, Stan. Anyway, let's make a plan for this 30-mark essay question to show how to answer the 30-mark question. Press pause to have a go at this. It's good to practice this. Make sure you've got a pen and paper ready to jot down your thoughts. Remember, it's only a plan at this stage and you can do it in any way you like. Jot down the key concepts, issues, debates, studies that you might use for this particular essay. So press pause now. This is a very rough outline of the main areas to cover, but we'll have a look at this in more detail. Remember, this question is always going to start with the same command word, evaluate. This requires you at the most basic level to discuss the view in support of the essay title and then look at least one different perspective, view, reason, cause, view, etc. If you consider the diagram in the last slide, it means in this most basic level here for this essay you would look at the external factors and then contrast this with internal factors. This is another useful way to get help with your thought process for essay questions. Try to put the title into your own words. If we go back to our general essay points, I said the following about writing introductions. If we apply these principles to this essay, an introduction might look something like this. My example isn't particularly fancy, but it does set the scene, acknowledges some of the terms in the question and recognises there are different views on this. Remember, it doesn't need to be too long. The main body of the essay is where you're going to be getting most of your marks, and that's what we'll have a look at next. With regards to the main body, I'm going to use the PERC paragraph technique as discussed. There's a whole raft of concepts you could use in this essay. I'm not going to use them all in my plan, but for reference, here is a list of some. The same could be said for studies. Again, I've provided a list of some of the main ones, but you wouldn't be expected to use all of these, and there may be some that don't appear that you could still use. Here is a list of things that are considered to be external factors, hence they could be used to support the view in the essay title that the reasons for social class differences are the product of factors outside of the school. But be careful, the question is actually asking why middle class kids do better. So if you're using cultural deprivation, you need to say that middle class kids in this case aren't deprived. Same for material deprivation, There's no deprivation here for the middle class student. Remember, you've got 45 minutes for this essay, so you could probably do a fairly decent amount of these factors. Let's have a look at what a paragraph might look like for one of these. This is the first sentence of the paragraph, assuming it's in the main body of the essay after the introduction. It's clearly linked to the essay title. The examiner can clearly see how it relates to the question asked. Having made a point, the next stage in PERC is E, and this closely relates to R, so much so that we're going to do E and R together in the next section. The next section in blue adds a bit more explanation to the point made at the start of the paragraph. Here, the purple section gives more detail. In other words, the point that has been explained now has more detail with reference to the findings of a study, concepts and examples. There is also a clear link back to the question in the last sentence. Pause now to read over. Now let's finish this paragraph with a C. The direct criticism can be seen here in red. Again, pause to read over this. Note this is a direct criticism of cultural factors, but when you look at other criticisms, such as internal factors, you might want to develop them as separate points. Here we have a list of internal factors that could be used to criticise the view in the essay title. Be careful when you're doing these. It's really important to make sure that you do link to the essay title. As I've said in the last bullet point, a smart answer may say there is a link between these factors. Be careful when you're using studies. I'm going to show you two different extracts. Read this first one. Now read this extract from student 2. What differences do you notice? Which would be most likely to be in the higher scoring essay response? I've noted the following points at the bottom of the page. Both paragraphs have knowledge of risk study. The first is very descriptive. The second also has knowledge, but crucially, it applies that knowledge to show the impact of labelling on achievement. Remember, when you're using studies, you need to make the findings relevant to the question. This question is stating a question, therefore, based on the evidence presented, you could come to some sort of conclusion, stating the extent to which the view in the title is correct. What side does your essay come down on? Is it internal, is it external, or maybe it's a bit of both?